Welcome to Can I Get a Retake, where we explore the accomplishments of our innovative community.
Each month, we speak with one of Great River Learning's higher ed instructors and authors.
Together, we discuss trends in education, areas of study, and a variety of teaching styles and philosophies.
My name is Michaela, your marketing coordinator.
My name is Michelle, your web design supervisor.
And this is Great River Learning's Can I Get a Retake? Today on Can I Get a Retake, we are speaking with historians Diane Margolf and Kristin Heineman. Both are teaching faculty in the history department at Colorado State University.
Diane is a professor of history at CSU with a specialty in early modern European history. She earned her undergrad degree in history from Pomona College, where she graduated magna cum laude before obtaining her master's and PhD from Yale University.
Now at CSU, Diane serves as chair of the College of Liberal Arts Curriculum Committee and as the college's representative to the University Curriculum Committee.
Kristin graduated summa cum laude with an undergraduate degree in history from the University of New Mexico. She went on to receive her PhD from the University of Newcastle in Australia. She is currently an associate teaching professor at Colorado State University, concentrating in Greek and Roman history, particularly the history of women and religion in the classical world.
Most importantly, but we are biased, Diane and Kristin combined their expertise to author Western Civilization from Antiquity to the Age of Expansion, an online textbook and course materials published by Great River Learning.
Continue listening to hear more about their research specialties and interests. Thank you for joining us, Diane and Kristin. Welcome to the pod.
The title of our podcast is Can I Get a Retake? So I have to ask if you guys have ever been asked by students, can I get a retake?
On more than one occasion, yep.
Oh, yes.
Just to jump in, can you tell us a little bit about your backgrounds? You could go back and forth, but also how you guys started working together and kind of what prompted this co-author situation.
So I read that question on your list of questions to prepare. And like a good historian, I did research. I went back into my email archives and I found an email from October 2014 from Michelle Smith, who identified herself as a senior acquisitions editor, who was going to be visiting the CSU campus and was curious to talk to me about the Western Civ class I teach, the textbook I use, the possibility of working on a textbook that would be digital through her company. And so for me, that's where it started. We set up a meeting, we met, we talked, and I think one of the first questions I asked her was, could I work with a co-author? Because I thought immediately of Kristin, whose office is right next to mine. And I knew that we both taught Western Civ. We both taught the pre-modern Western Civ survey here at CSU. And I thought it would be great to work with someone whose field of expertise spans the ancient part of that class, which is, I mean, I know just enough to be dangerous, but and enough to teach it legitimately, but obviously I do not have her level of expertise. So from the outset, I thought it would be great to work with someone else, and she was the person I thought of.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Back in the email archives of 2014.
That's right.
Such historians.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had always kind of thought, that I wanted, it's so much easier teaching from your own publication, I found, and we can get into that a little bit later on. But yeah, I thought it was just such a perfect sort of marriage between Diane's specialization and mine, because I'm far more comfortable with the antiquity side of things. And again, probably just enough to be dangerous once we get past sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So yeah, our expertise kind of dovetailed perfectly to sort of split it quite evenly. I get the first half and she took the second half of the material. And yeah, I think it made sense because we were the only ones, I still think we are the only ones that teach the pre-modern Western Civ in our department. And it just so happens that we both kind of teach either side of it or specialize in either side of it. And so, yeah, when Diane asked me, I was like, I am more than happy to, because I had several issues with other textbooks and I had tried several of them and none of them fit particularly well. There's good things and bad things about all of them. But this was a good opportunity to kind of make my class a little bit more my own, I suppose.
I wrote down Kristin ancient on my notes. And I just wanted to come back. So, I mean, our next thing that we really wanted to get into was what each of your specialties is. If you could tell us more about, like what gets you going, what you enjoy about the history, if you have any research interests that you dive into at the college, that'd be great. So I guess Kristin ancient, if you want to go.
Sure. Yeah, so I actually kind of came to the classics. Classics is the study of Greek and Roman history, literature, language, and culture. I kind of came at it sort of a roundabout way. I had been studying Spanish since a kid, and then in college, I had been taking Spanish again, but then it didn't work with my schedule or something. And so sort of like as a lark, I just took a Latin class because I was like, oh, it must be like Spanish. It must be easy like Spanish is. I was mistaken. But I really fell in love with it. And I actually started studying Roman history through Latin. And I just got really into it. I really appreciated how it was just a much different approach, learning that language, whereas, Spanish is more like, ¿Dónde está el baño? And Latin is more like, the blood of tyrants will fill the streets. And it was just very, I found a lot of, I don't know, it was just this different approach to how people think and talk and speak. And I just really got very much into it. And so I kind of started my history path down the ancient Greek and Roman side. And then through my studies and through my PhD, I started really focusing, again, something we'll be getting into is more marginalized voices. So particularly women. I think Diane and I, one of the things that we have in common is, I think as female historians, we tend to really try and highlight the female experience throughout history. So one of the ways in antiquity that is really highlighted is through religion. And so a lot of my interests are sort of the intersection between Greek and Roman history and women and religion, which is what a lot of my research is in. And originally I was doing mostly Greek stuff. And then since teaching, I was originally hired at CSU to teach mostly Greek classes. And then an opportunity to teach more Roman classes came up and I was like, I would love to. And so I kind of had to hit the books again to refresh some of my Roman history, and I fell in love with it all over again. And so now I'm actually more, some of my research interests are now in kind of Roman military history, which I never in a million years would have guessed I would have found myself there. But I think because of some of the video games that are out nowadays, my students know a bit more than I do. So I was like, oh gosh, I need to know what a Mortafino helmet is and all this different stuff. So my students have actually really encouraged me to sort of broaden my scope of interests and stuff, which that's the best part about teaching is it's just, you never stop learning yourself, which is great.
There has been an interesting resurgence in Roman history. It never died, but even on Reddit, there's multiple subreddits that are just dedicated really niche examples of Roman architecture, Roman history, Roman military history. So it's kind of cool to see.
Hollywood, I think, has really sort of greased the skids for that. I think a lot of students come through more popular media back to the histories of it, which is great.
Diane, do you want to tell us a little bit about your specialization after post-ancient?
Yes, sure. So I've always been interested in European history, especially in the medieval and early modern periods. So roughly between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And so I've always been interested in the Renaissance, the religious reform movements of the 16th century, the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, and so on. When I went to graduate school, I thought that I would specialize in English history for that period, but I ended up crossing the channel and specializing in French history instead. And so part of my research interest is in that early modern period, specifically for France. When I got my job here at CSU, I was hired to be the early modernist. And so as Kristin referred to, what you study and what you teach tends to be an inverted pyramid, right? You study this, but you teach far more broadly than that. And teaching the first half of the Western Civ survey, of course, takes me from antiquity up to about the 16th century. I knew a little bit about, and I sort of felt comfortable teaching a little bit about ancient Greece and Rome, because the Renaissance is very much about a revival of interest in and attributing new value to that chunk of history. But of course, I don't teach it like a Renaissance humanist. I teach it like a historian who, like Kristin, encounters students who are very interested in some of the more the areas I don't know very well, and whose interests and questions prompt me to think about what new things I need to incorporate into my lectures. So my research interests and publications have been mostly more situated in the history of France and the Reformation, but teaching courses, upper division courses on the Renaissance, on the Age of Enlightenment, and of course the Western Civ Survey really makes me aware of how much there is, and how much there is always new stuff to learn to teach, because learning something for your own interest or for a project is not the same thing as learning something that you need to be able to present to students, or that might inform, an essay question, a paper topic, a primary source selection. So yeah, that's kind of where my research interests intersect with my teaching. And I totally agree with Kristin. My interests about religion and politics have strongly intersected with gender, because one of the most important directions in my field of history in the past 30 or 40 years has been incorporating people whose voices don't ordinarily get heard, and giving more attention to the role of women, whether they're outstanding individuals or whether it's women as a group, how they are perceived in culture and how they sometimes push back against those perceptions.
When it comes to bringing those marginalized voices to life, what tools do you have to do in order to find that information? How are you able to incorporate that into your lectures and into your title?
That's a great question. And like Diane, my field is the same. The last 30 or 40 years has had a huge push to incorporate race, class, and gender. A lot of that, I think, is really the diversity of the field itself. More female historians are coming in, or there's just a great deal more female historians than there have been in the past. And so the interest, I think, of fleshing out the female experience sometimes starts with women historians. And for classics, it's hard because our body of evidence is so small. And sometimes we do get amazing finds of, some archaeological finds, or, this text that hasn't been that's been lost for centuries. So sometimes there are new pieces of information, but for my field particularly, I think it's more of reading the old information, the original or the available evidence, just with a new lens, because the vast majority of ancient evidence is written by men for men. Women don't really get a lot of a voice. And so it's kind of reading in between the lines. A lot of it is seeing when women are not incorporated, and that actually tells us a great deal. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes and the silent dog in the nighttime. I can't remember what that title was, where, never mind, please.
The dog that didn't bark.
Yes, exactly. The curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. There it is. Wow. Edit that. But reading the original material with this new lens of just highlighting when there is a passing mention of a woman, or men talking about what their wives ought to be doing, and even though sometimes it is very chauvinistic and frankly misogynist, that does tell us again a great deal about the experience of women. So I think, using a different lens and just looking for it, whereas many historians, a century or so ago just didn't really care to look for it, the majority of them. And so just reading old material in new ways, I think, is one of the best ways to go about it.
Yes, I agree totally with that. And the pattern is much the same in my field as well. Having more women historians in the field has meant that they are especially prompted to ask those questions about where are the records by women, where are the records about women, how can we put those things together, reading sources against the grain. I suspect in my field we have more source material in some ways, but the practice of reading for what isn't there as well as what is, and a whole body of scholarship that other historians have generated about women in the Reformation, in the Renaissance, looking at the way women wrote about intellectual life as well as the way men wrote about intellectual life, and what they sometimes said about what women should and should or should not be able to do in intellectual life, is a way of prompting some of those questions. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on saying, these were the standard expectations, but here's an example of someone who pushed back or who did something different. And I also think we strike a balance between looking at outstanding individuals, women were these heroic figures who did extraordinary things, but also keeping in mind the experience of many ordinary women who did not leave voices of their own, traces of their own. And for that, in much the way that Kristin mentioned for antiquity, the interest in material culture, I think, has been important. I mean, scholars in my field have been looking at things like tapestries and embroidery as evidence of women's work and women's artistic talents in ways that I don't think 50 years ago historians would have said. And so sometimes, although I'm very much a document text-based historian, that is definitely my comfort zone when it comes to sources, but I'm aware of the fact, and I like to introduce students to the fact that images and material culture elements, objects of everyday life, can also give us insight into what ordinary people did and how they lived and what things they used in ways that a text may not. A text may be limited, it can be offset by using some of those other materials.
And I think to add on to that of how we incorporate some of this into the text is I try to strike a balance when there are sort of notable women, queens, and very wealthy nobility women. There is quite a bit more evidence usually regarding these more extraordinary or upper class or royalty, something like this. But I do kind of introduce my students, look, I like how Diane said, read against the grain or in between the lines. What can we glean from these documents about the normal women's experience? And so a lot of that comes for me when I'm teaching is through some of the primary source documents that we've incorporated to show, even though this is about a war, it does kind of mention, the wife gets upset when they're off to war, and what does that tell us? And things like this. So a lot of the way that I help my students understand the experience of women in the past is through reading the primary source material, the primary documents that we have.
I think that's fantastic responses. Not everyone was a Hypatia or a Hatshepsut, but I think the vast majority of humans were living those ordinary everyday lives, and I'm curious about them as well. So I love that we're doing this work now in these really different ways that we did it in the past to uncover what it was like for them. So thank you both for that answer.
Yeah.
I think the last big question I have in regards to your research is, so your title spans this 3 millennia's worth of time, people, events from ancient Mesopotamia to the European encounters and expansion in the Americas. How do you decide who and what to include?
That's a great, difficult question. There is so much. And honestly, that's one of the drawbacks of a survey course, is because you kind of have to sacrifice any depth of knowledge with breadth of knowledge. And so we kind of barely scratch the surface, but kind of introduce, these are a whole variety of different topics that influence and are incorporated into Western civilization. But I did struggle with that. And I remember when we were writing the publication, kind of laboring over, oh goodness. It's more of weeding out what you don't want and not getting too much and not getting too much detail, because there's so much to cover. And then I also kind of ran up against the problem of, I don't want to just regurgitate in the textbook what I say in lecture. And since I had already had my lectures that I'd been kind of, have had prepared for some time, I didn't want to just repeat what I say in class in the book. And so I was trying my best to sort of highlight some of the things and go into a bit more depth of things I don't go into depth about in lecture. And then also having a co-author where there's, a sort of dance of trying to have a coherent sort of methodology across my sections and Diane's sections. So that part was arguably perhaps the trickiest part of this whole process. And I think I kind of, I don't know if I have a real great pithy response to explain how I chose, but a lot of it was sort of standard across many textbooks that I had read. These are some of the highlights that sort of the discipline seems to agree are important. And then I would make sure at every turn to incorporate women's voices or the marginalized ones. I tried my best to kind of keep a bit of an emphasis on that. I don't know, Diane, if you have perhaps a better explanation than I do.
No,
that is a struggle
really.
we have.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you highlighted exactly the points that are a struggle, I think, for anyone who writes a textbook for a survey class, because it's a very broad canvas, and it's great in some ways to have such a broad amount of time to teach about, but you can't cover everything, and you certainly can't cover everything in equal detail. So it's always about deciding, where do you put individual examples? Where do you put more general information? It's not just what gets in and what gets left out, but how much time, attention, and in the context of the book, how much space do you devote to explaining different things? One thing I remember early on when we started working on this, Kristin and I went for coffee, and we talked about how we approached the teaching of our classes. And I remember thinking that this would probably work out really well, because it seemed to me that we had similar emphases and similar approaches. I did not say Julius Caesar, well, we can skip him. She did not say Leonardo da Vinci, who was that? And of course, neither one of us said, oh, well, religion, we can kind of fluff that off. And women, yeah, well, a mention here or there will be sufficient. So I think we had a similar approach to trying to identify the things that we wanted to emphasize, as opposed to the things that we would provide less information about. With the proviso, as Kristin said, you can always go into class and tell your students, I'm relying on you to read what the textbook says about X. What I'm going to talk about today is this. And there's always ways to build connections between those. We have events and people in our textbook who are controversial. And sometimes we can refer to them and describe them and analyze them in the book. But in class, we can talk about controversies, different interpretations, changing interpretations of events, of developments of people. And so that's a way to keep, what happens in the classroom connected to what the textbook says, but also different from it. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I would say about that is about, the span and what to leave in and what to leave out. I think our fields are always changing. There are always new ways to adjust that. It may not be possible to adjust the book on a dime, but you can always adjust your lectures to accommodate things that have emerged, topics that may be of great interest to students one year, whereas they weren't the year before. And I think an example of this, of course, is our textbook deals with the Black Death, the bubonic plague of the medieval period, which comes across, I think, very different to students who've been through a pandemic. Mm-hmm. You can talk about the impact of contagion, epidemic disease, before the pandemic and after the pandemic, but what you say and how students react to it is likely to be very different because of something that has changed completely outside our book. So I think there's always an ongoing process of deciding how much time to spend on one thing, what to talk about in class, and what to tell students I'm relying on you to read this in the book because that's where that information is.
Teaching the Black Death has changed dramatically for me over the last couple semesters. It definitely hits home with the students. One of the other things that I was thinking while you were speaking, Diane, was there's also some pretty uniform themes across history, things such as power and politics, and what's the nature of authority, and how do you gain and keep authority, and those sort of things are actually quite similar between the ancient world and even perhaps the modern world. And also religion is a theme that we can see and kind of compare across different cultures, the experience of women. And technology, the development of technology, things like this that I think, again, when Diane and I kind of chatted about it in the earlier stages of this project, is that we both kind of talked about these similar sorts of things. And so I think I was writing my side of the thing of the textbook, then I was trying to make sure that I'm incorporating, power and religion and authority, things that we both tended to highlight throughout our teaching.
Yeah, agreed, very much so. And those are also the kinds of themes and topics that they carry over among lots of textbooks. They carry over from our textbook across the span of it. And they also bridge to what we do in class and what we're expecting students to read in the textbook and in the primary sources. So they are ways of providing coherence and kind of a framework for those individual choices about, how much do we say about France versus about England? How much do we say about this individual versus this individual? And so there are ways, I think, where we can track, and hopefully our students and readers can track across the textbook things that they would expect to read about. Political power and who gets it and how do you keep it, the position of women, social hierarchies, who has what status in society, how are societies organized, what are the ideals of social organization as opposed to the realities of it. And these are the kinds of things that we found that I think we were already approaching in a similar way. And so I think we tried to incorporate that into the book as well.
Yeah, I love that approach to sort of disseminating the information between your book and lectures. Sorry.
No, I thought kind of agreeing with the fluidity there. And it kind of makes me wonder too, how much we have our written records, how much was happening in the lectures in antiquity that we don't have access to because it wasn't written down, or even the lectures during the French Reformation, what don't we have access to? So it's just a little sorrow and grief for maybe what's lost there. But
they say maybe 1% to 3% of all written material from antiquity has survived, which is not a lot.
No, that's so sad.
I know, yeah.
But there's
grieve
still
about that
so
regularly.
much that we can learn from what we have too.
Right.
So I think the next session was really going into, and I think you touched on it kind of with that initial contact with Michelle Smith back in 2014, is what inspired you to actually take that step and write this material together?
Or if Michelle Smith had a really good sales email, I'd like to know so I can pass that to
verbatim,
the sales
please.
team.
Yeah.
Well, I can forward you her email. I think Kristin actually mentioned this, which is teaching with other people's textbooks always meant for me figuring out how can I align with what the decisions made by other authors about what to include, what to leave out, how much space, how much time to include on things where maybe there was more than I wanted on one thing and less than I wanted on another. I remember I struggled especially with the medieval period because I wanted to be able to teach in class about the Latin West, the Byzantine Empire, and Islamic civilization separately as individual examples of cultures and societies, so that students would understand kind of the main features of each and then bring them together for the Crusades. And I found that a struggle with the textbook I was using at the time, because the textbook treated it chronologically. And so it broke up the period in chronological chunks, with each of the three making an appearance in each chapter. And so I was, in a sense, fighting the textbook. And one thing I thought of when I started thinking about Michelle's invitation to consider doing this project was, gosh, I could maybe write those chapters the way I would want to teach them and not have to have a whole guide to reading the other textbook, these pages this week, these pages this week.
Right.
So that was one of the things that inspired me. By golly, I can make the textbook align with the way that I want to present the material, the order in which I want to present material, as opposed to trying to adjust to other people's decisions.
Yeah. And I found that none of the books that I was using were satisfactory. So I felt like I was changing, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try this book this time. And now I'm going to try this other book. And so I just never really felt satisfied. And then I felt I was having to chop up the textbook and have them go back and read this thing, because it was more chronological instead of, I mean, our book is chronological, but it's also thematic, and more even maybe geographical kind of gets in there. It's not strictly chronological, which I feel like gets problematic, because then you have sort of this like diachronic sort of thing where you're going back and forth instead of, you know, maybe just going back in time a few times to look at things more uniformly. And so, yeah, I love how Diane says it, fighting the textbook, where it should be this tool to help me instead of me battling against it constantly. So yeah, that was a huge impetus for me as well, of just having it where I'm intimately familiar with it, which has been a very helpful, you know, it makes it easier to teach from it when you know it back to front, as we do. And also, yeah, making sure that it highlights the things that I want in the kind of time and quantity that I want, so that I can emphasize the things that I think are important more in lecture, or that sort of thing. So it just makes it a lot more an ease of teaching a class that is so, you know, so long of a time and so much material to cover, that that's already an issue. And so having it kind of more suited to our own needs has been, yeah, very helpful.
And I also think it's been helpful because of what it does for our students. They're not constantly engaged, willingly or not, with our battle with our textbook when it's not one that we have really had a lot of control over. And we're able to, students can see connections between the textbook and the lecture material very directly, also between paper topics, between primary source readings and things we talk about in lecture, discussion questions that we give them, things we ask them to talk about and think about and write about for papers or for essay exams. And I think it's also kind of a pragmatic decision. You know, one of the reasons I felt the way I did about the way I wanted to present the Byzantine Empire, Islamic civilization, and the Latin West is because they're, you know, following them chronologically, I think undercuts one of the things I really wanted, which was for students to have some basic sense. When someone says the Byzantine Empire, what is that? What are its major features? Where does it fit chronologically? What are some of the things that made it distinctive? And a textbook that takes a chronological approach spreads that out. And I think it undercuts the idea of giving students, admittedly, a basic, a sort of a set of information that is pragmatic and limited. But then, you know, tell them, if you want to read more about this, there are lots of books, there are lots of sources, there may be other courses you can take. You can find out more about it, but I'm not constantly trying to find a way to communicate to them without the help of my textbook as my combatant instead of my ally. Here's a basic set of things that you need to know, important people, important events, important features that make this particular chunk of Western civilization's history significant and distinctive.
Yeah.
And I think that too is how I kind of approach Western Civ, is because I would even say the vast majority of students who take it for one option of many as a required university credit. And so we have biomedical engineering students and, you know, business majors and very few, well, some history majors as well, but it seems so tangential to what they are used to and the types of learning that they normally do. And so that I feel like is kind of an uphill battle oftentimes to keep students who probably have never really enjoyed a history class engaged. And so I find that sometimes my job for these survey courses is to introduce them in these various topics over time in a more coherent sort of foundational way, instead of, again, chopping things up. And I feel like there's already so much information that they're trying to kind of get in this cohesive sort of, put it in little boxes in their brain, or however that works. Having it more thematic, I think, helps them get at least a foundational knowledge of that. Oh, then I am interested in the Byzantine Empire or what have you, and maybe I will read a book on this. I want to make it easier to sort of consume all of this various information over a great vast period of time, so that that they're not put off by history completely. That it is more of, let's introduce you to these topics so you can find out what you're interested in, hopefully learn more. So I hope that our textbook does that a bit better than some of the other ones that I had read that do chop it up a bit more. And when it's so much information, it's harder when you get it piecemeal as opposed to more bigger chunks, I guess. I think that might be easier for students to incorporate that information.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Kristin said. This is, in many respects, this survey course that we teach, for many of the students who take it, this is probably the first, the last, and the only college level history course they will take. This is it. And so this is our shot to give them a sense of what it means to be a historian, what historians do, how we approach our discipline. In this case, it's about Western civilization, but it could be about other things. And so I think that's why we pay attention to the big themes we want to introduce and trace through the course and through the book, the sources we want students to be exposed to, situations like asking, so what was the position of women, pick a time period, because this is our one shot to communicate to some of these students what the study of history, at least at the college level, is all about. For many of them, up until that point, it's been nothing but a list of dates. And many of them come in as, shall we say, a skeptical audience. They're not at all convinced that they're going to like this course. They're taking it for a requirement. So this is our chance to kind of push back against that a little bit with the teaching materials we have, as well as with the way we teach the class.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about it too is one of the issues I was running up against with other textbooks that I had been using is sometimes you could also require students to buy a supplemental primary source reader, but it was never one. I guess you could get package ones and things like this, but then again, it was like, this is not the primary source I want my students reading. This is, now I have to think of a whole other approach to this primary source that's now in the text that I made them buy. So I feel, that I have to engage with this material that I hadn't really planned on, or it's not exactly what I wanted.
You didn't pick it.
So, yes. And so now the primary source material, again, I feel like it's reinforcing some of the major points that we had tried to flush out throughout the chapter. And so the primary source material for me has been just a game changer in the ease in which I'm assigning papers, which are based on those primary sources. And because there's quite a few different ones per chapter, I can kind of switch it up every semester. So it's not, I don't feel like I'm reading the same paper over and over. So yeah, I think the primary material also has been, was a big drive for me to want to publish it. And then now the ease of having exactly what I want has been really helpful.
Yeah, I'd imagine for, a subject that students aren't necessarily interested in and are kind of confused about maybe already, having the course itself be confusing because of jumping around and choosing different things and, read this chapter, now read this chapter, making all of that more coherent and consistent probably gets them a little bit more interested, or at least, like you said, like puts it in the boxes in their brain. They can organize it in a more effective manner. And I think too that with both of you using now the same book that you've worked on together, your courses, the sections that you teach are probably more aligned now and consistent across the sections, and students are getting more of the same course than maybe they got with you both using either different books or different parts of different books. So just more consistent altogether all around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is one of the gripes that I hear from my students in the surveys, is just like, oh my goodness, there's just so much information, what are we responsible for? And so to have, the themes to highlight and that sort of thing, I think does kind of hyper focuses them on the things that I think are important, that I would like for them to sort of remember and understand.
Yeah, they don't get caught in the crossfire between trying to teach what you want to teach, let's say in the classroom, versus what you are and having them read and requiring them to be responsible for in some fashion in the textbook that is not the way it doesn't emphasize things. It doesn't necessarily highlight the things you want. And so I think when I think of myself as, fighting the textbook or fighting a textbook, the students kind of get caught in the crossfire. And this way that's avoided, because the textbook very much reflects the things that we want to emphasize in the class itself.
As we come up on the end here, we do have a little segment we call You're Wrong, which is just your opportunity to kind of enlighten us about some like the biggest misconception in either your course or the field of history in general that's perpetuated, that people assume this about history, that you want to kind of set straight and say you're wrong.
This is your rant.
This is your chance to rant. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's just so many. I'm trying to.
I know, you can have time to.
I'm really sorry I delayed our starting on this, because you lost 20
I'll cancel
minutes
my
of
lunch
ranting.
plan.
20 minutes of venting here. Oh my gosh.
If you could pick,
Oh,
you
goodness.
could pick one. And I mean, you could both do rant about something different if you want to. But
One of the ones that I kind of get on my soapbox about with my students is about Christopher Columbus, because I remember as a kid in school learning this very whitewashed kind of, what a great guy discovering America, and, yay. The world used to be flat before Christopher Columbus, or some nonsense like this. And so that's one of the ones that I tend to set the story straight with my students, that one, there's probably more people on the planet today that believe the world is flat than the days of Christopher Columbus, which is a whole other
a whole other rant.
Yes, exactly.
But
But
also
also just
on that.
yeah, exactly. One of the things that I tend to emphasize in my classes is, just because these people thought this was valuable information, or the preconceptions that we have about colonialism and imperialism, that, we need to frame those ideas in a more modern lens. Try not to judge people by our own standards of the past, but also the way we deal with the past today should reflect our moral standards of today. And so not glorify Columbus as this amazing guy because he did, enslave and murder and pillage and, set a trajectory in motion that destroyed many great cultures. And so rather than kind of celebrating him as this great, European, I don't even know, a great guy, is kind of bring it down a notch and look at the reality of at maybe it wasn't necessarily his intention to destroy all of the native populations with disease and this sort of thing, but these are consequences, and we shouldn't necessarily glorify people in the past for some of the things that they might have thought was okay, but now this is not okay. I don't know. That's one of mine, is Columbus, but I'll just pick the one.
I'm here for it.
Yeah. I think a lot of people today would agree with you on that too.
Yeah. Luckily, yeah. But still, my students, I ask, did you guys learn that Columbus discovered that the world was round? And I still see some hands, and it's like, oh goodness sakes, what are we?
I know. And it's like it's an elementary school thing too, I feel like.
Yeah.
They start us early on the propaganda, I guess. Yeah.
And I mean, I can appreciate that, because you don't want to talk about,
Right.
age appropriate history for children is also, but you don't need to invent misinformation either. Right. So it's yeah.
Diane.
I know, Diane,
Yeah.
do you have
Yeah, so I think, and since I'm the person who wrote the section about Columbus, and
I know. Sorry.
Columbus
Stole your
falls into
thunder.
the section of the course where we're in, my wheelhouse, so to speak. So I totally understand and agree with the importance of getting across to students at that point in the class. Some larger issues, and your example of Columbus, Kristin, highlights one of mine, which is, I think one of the things that I want students to understand is that history is complicated. It is complex. It is difficult. Some of my students clearly think this is going to be an easy class because it's a 100 level history class and they're senior engineering majors, right? How hard can it be? After we've gotten to week 2 and they've been disabused of that misconception, and they've realized, no, reading, writing, thinking are called for at all times in this class. But I think, I guess one of my vents is there's a tendency for people to want to see history as a matter of heroes and villains. And how do we identify turning points in history? How do we identify the things that are important to know in history as opposed to the stuff that isn't important to know? And so, like Kristin said, when I teach about Columbus, I tend to point out the fact that from a European perspective, what he did looked like a discovery. From the perspective of the people who were already in the places that he discovered, his actions, everything that he did has a very different viewpoint. It looks very different. And it looks, in fact, quite negative in many respects. So the lesson I want students to learn about the study of history is that even in this introductory level broad survey class where we are almost constantly hop, skipping, and jumping across the major people and the major events, one thing to learn from this is that history is complex. That lesson you learned about Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, that might have been fine in elementary school, but this is college. And at the college level, I want students to understand that history is not simple. It's never simple. It's never been simple. And one of the ways that we should embrace that complexity is by challenging, what did Columbus really do? Who has decided that what he did was good or that what he did was bad? Taking on the responsibility of making those judgments means you have to look at things from more than one point of view. You have to look at them from present as well as perspectives from the past. How people saw Columbus in his day is different than the way we see him today. We should be able to talk about that. Students should be able to write about that in a civil and respectful way, and understand that just because your elementary school teacher taught you that Columbus was great, you can disagree with that person now. I'm not suggesting you call them up and rant about how wrong they were, but we can have discussions about these different perspectives and different views of historical events and historical people, and kind of not fall into the trap of saying, well, this person was a hero, this person was a villain, this person was great, this person wasn't. The historical truth is usually much more complicated than that. And so if there's one thing I want students to take away from our class and from reading our textbook as part of that, is to kind of understand and be willing to embrace that complexity, as opposed to wanting it to be simple, wanting to be able to divide things into black and white. If we're going to change our judgments about someone like Columbus, which we definitely should do, let's have good reasons for it. Let's base it on looking at lots of different sources and lots of different perspectives, rather than just saying, well, I learned in elementary school Columbus was a hero. I'm going to stick my fingers in my ears when my college professors tell me something different.
I love
so
that.
It's not exactly, here's where you're wrong, but it's more like, here's where I think we can do better.
Yeah.
Right.
There you go.
I love the way you put that, Diane. That was great.
That has such broader implications too, just for people's mindset as they go about their lives, that not everything is black and white. Everything's more complex than that. So thank you so much for coming on and joining us. I think we had an amazing conversation, and I'm excited to get this out there. Thank you so much, Diane and Kristin, for joining us on today's episode. You can really feel the passion, not only for your subject matter, but for your pedagogy and the structure of your course and lectures. Both of you have similar teaching styles, which has allowed you to work well together in the development of your digital course materials too.
As we close this episode, I am left with the concept that history is this living thing. Kristin and Diane talk about how we can uncover different pieces while interpreting old manuals and scripts and materials in different ways. We also mourn to some of the pieces that are lost to us from time. The last thing I'm left with is how interesting that what resonates from the past is due to the circumstances in the present. When Kristin talks about the Black Death and how it affects students who lived through COVID, it makes us wonder about the next generation. What's happening in our time that they will see reflected in their own present?
Can I Get a Retake is hosted by Michelle Manneman and Michaela Albee. The show is edited by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast was designed by Michelle Manneman. Our intro and outro music was created by Coma Media.
If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, share, rate, and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts. To join the conversation, you can find us on Instagram at Can I Get a Retake. For show notes and episode transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com/podcast.